Welcome everyone to the symposium, Unexpected Partners, Self-Taught Artists and Modernism in Interwar America. Thank you for joining us across time zones today for an exciting programs of presentations and conversations. So please know that enclosed captioning is available by clicking at the bottom of your screen on the CC button, and also today's program is interpreted live in American Sign Language. As you can see, we have an interpreter interpreting every word I say. Thank you so much. My name is Mathilde Walker-Bio. I'm curator of programming at the American Folk Art Museum. Before we begin, I would like to first acknowledge that I'm joining you from Lenape-Hawking, the unceded traditional homeland of the Lenape Delaware peoples. We honor Lenape peoples, past, present, and future, and are committed to centering Indigenous perspectives in exhibition and programs at the museum. As many of you know, our museum is dedicated to uplifting the work of self-taught artists across time and place. And we are thrilled to celebrate the work of Morris Hirshfield with our current exhibition, Morris Hirshfield Rediscovered. It's closing this Sunday, so if you can, I really encourage to see this fabulous show, which is the most comprehensive presentation of Hirshfield's work with over 40 paintings of the artist. We are grateful for opportunities like this to connect online, which will not be possible without the National Endowment for the Humanities and all of you here. Today's symposium was made possible through generous support from the Terra Foundation for American Art and in partnership with Stanford University. So as you can see, we have a very rich and exciting program ahead of us. As you can see in the schedule, we will begin by hearing opening remarks from Jason T. Bush and Richard Meyer. Following these introductions, there will be, can you go to the former slide, please? Yes, okay, thank you, sorry. So following these introductions, we will hear from 8 speakers: Jennifer Jane Marshall, Brooke Wyatt, Suzanne Davidson, Lynn Cook, Bill Antes, Nicole Smith-Johnson, and Rodrigo Mura and Julia Bryan Wilson, followed by closing remarks by Jane Collier. One update to our speakers list: unfortunately, Marcy Kwon, who was scheduled to participate in session 2, is no longer able to join us today. So each session will be introduced by a different moderator: Esther Adler for session 1, Valérie Rousseau for the second panel, and Angela Miller for our third and final session. These moderators will facilitate a short conversation and Q&A at the end of each session. So we invite you to share your questions for the speakers throughout their talks using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Throughout the day, we will be using the chat room to share more details about the program, so updates about the schedule, speakers' biographies. Please feel free to use this feature to ask any question you may have about the unfolding of the symposium. So today's symposium is being recorded and will be published online later this week. We will also be publishing written proceedings, which will be made available and distributed online in the coming months. Thanks to our IT director who is behind the scene, Richard Ho, for his technical support today. And thank you to all of you for being here. So without further ado, it's my pleasure and honor to invite Jason T. Bush, Becky, and Bob Alexander, director and CEO of the museum, to make opening remarks, followed by Richard Meyer, Robert and Ruth Halperin Professor in Art History at Stanford University, curator of our current exhibition, Morris Hirshfield Rediscovered, and author of The Master of the Two Left Feet, a book that accompanies the exhibition. Please join me in welcoming Jason T. Bush. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mathilde, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you who are joining us, as I know we have participants joining us from all over the world. There are several hundred who are just tuning in now, and we know we have more than 600 participants we hope to engage with us over the course of the day. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this symposium, Unexpected Partners, Self-Taught Art and Modernism in Interwar America. This symposium on modernism's complex interchange with self-taught art is organized in conjunction, as Mathilde had mentioned, with the American Folk Art Museum's current exhibition, Morris Hirshfield Rediscovered, which is the first retrospective of the artist in 80 years. From the scholarship and research of art historians and curators Richard Meyer and Susan Davidson, and the stewardship at AFAM by curator Valerie Russo, this exhibition features over half of the artist's 80 paintings and drawings that trace his brief but sensational career here in New York. It reintroduces to us a singular artist whose work has been obscured since his death in 1946. Morris Hirshfield Rediscovered is at the heart of the American Folk Art Museum's programs dedicated to elevating the artworks of modern and contemporary self-taught artists. We are honored that this exhibition has been well received by guests, hundreds, thousands of guests, truly, at our museum and by the international press, and was celebrated as one of the best exhibitions of 2022 in both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. I encourage you to see Morris Hirshfield Rediscovered on view through the remainder of this week at our Lincoln Square location in Manhattan, where admission to the museum is always free. There you can purchase Richard Meyer's Master of the Two Left Feet, a superb book that accompanies our exhibition and reflects Meyer's deep engagement with Morris Hirshfield's paintings and the artist's major contribution to the field of self-taught art. We also sell copies of the book online at folkartmuseum.org. I also hope you will consider joining me and thousands of other enthusiasts of the American Folk Art Museum through a donation to the museum following this symposium. Your financial support has impact, and it does make a great difference in our ability to promote self-taught artists across time and place. Today, we will hear from a dynamic range of curators, scholars, and art historians. These speakers will revisit a vital moment during the interwar period when a vanguard of artists, including Morris Hirshfield, were in dialogue. This symposium will reconsider the significant role that these artists played in the development of modernism, situating their works within a broader artistic, cultural, and socio-historical context. This symposium is made possible through very generous support from the Terra Foundation for American Art. I also extend gratitude to the Department of Art and Art History at Stanford University for co-presenting this symposium. And my thanks to all of you, to each of you again, for joining us for what will truly be a very exciting day. And now it's my great pleasure to welcome Richard Meyer.
Good morning or afternoon for those who are a little bit ahead of us time-wise today. I'm Richard Meyer, very pleased to be here and so grateful for the home that Morris Hirshfield's work has found for the last several months at the American Folk Art Museum and all of the support that and attention that work has received. I'm going to give a talk today that, let's see, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. And I'm hoping, Mathilde, can you see this?
Yes.
Great. And it's called Change Partners and Dance, Morris Hirshfield's Modernism. His character glides across the floor and on the left of a swanky nightclub. He's just asked someone very hastily to dance with him so that he can go on the dance floor. And he gets near to Rogers, whose character is dancing with her fiance. You see this grim-faced man with her. And Esther begins to sing to her. And this is the lyrics. Must you dance, every dance, with the same fortunate man? You have danced with him since the music began. Won't you change partners and dance with me? Shortly after Esther finishes the song, Rogers exits the room in apparent irritation at this unwanted serenade and retires to an outdoor pavilion. Esther follows, and the couple engages in a dance sequence whose beauty outdistances everything in the film prior to this moment. And here you're seeing two moments on the right from that dance sequence outdoors, where they're finally coming together, and Rogers is beginning to recognize her attraction and connection to Esther through this dance. While the whole premise of Carefree is to have Rogers switch partners and dance with Esther, the moment when she does so is no less magical for that. Modern artworks and the stories we tell about them likewise benefit from engaging in new partnerships and choreography. Received knowledges change when we juxtapose them with obscure or half-forgotten stories. Narratives of individual achievement and heroic innovation give way to a view of multiple art worlds and competing versions of modernity. It is not a question of choosing between the canonical and the eccentric, but rather of devising a framework within which both may be seen to constitute art history. This has been a central goal of my work on Morris Hirshfield in both written and curatorial form. I was drawn to Hirshfield and am drawn to him and his work for a number of reasons. I'm captivated by the artist's unlikely story from poor Jewish immigrant tailor to internationally recognized artist, and the visual intricacy and delightful weirdness of his work. But as I researched the artist, I became increasingly convinced that his brief but spectacular career from 1939, the date he finished his first paintings, to his death in 1936, that his career illuminates mid-century modernism in ways that have not been previously known or explored, or I should say not been fully known or explored. This conviction was sparked for me, not by Hirshfield's work on its own, but by that work in dialogue with Sidney Janis, Peggy Guggenheim, Pete Mondrian, André Breton, Alfred Barr, and the Museum of Modern Art, among other individuals and institutions in the early 1940s. As I argue in Master of the Two Left Feet, this was an active dialogue between Hirshfield and his interlocutors, rather than, as was often claimed by detractors at the time, a one-way process in which art world elites exploited a guileless old man, a goat, as one critic called him, actually an old goat, that he was exploited by elites for their own amusement and preening self-satisfaction. In what follows, I demonstrate the ability of Hirshfield's art to change partners and dance, in a sense, both in the 1940s and today. Far from being orchestrated exclusively by others, these changes flowed and continue to flow from the power of his work and its refusal to submit to the categories such as folk, modern, primitive, naive, outsider, to which it has been assigned. And when I say refusal to submit, I mean actually that it inhabits those categories while also being very insistently and importantly in dialogue with others, such as surrealism, modernism, avant-garde, and actually just the idea of modern art itself, with modern in the fullest sense of the word. In 2015, I visited so this is my first unexpected partnership, or that of Hirshfield. And I'm trying to, okay, I go forward. Can you see that okay, Mathilde? Yes, I'm just going to assume you can see it.
Yes.
Okay. In 2015, I visited the newly reinstalled modern galleries at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. For the first time, pre-1945 European and American works were hung side by side. This defied, and this was a rehang by the curator Sheena Wagstaff and I think particularly Randy Griffey. And I was reviewing it for Art Forum. Okay, for the first time, pre-1945 European and American works were hung side by side. This defied the long-standing judgment that American art before World War II was either derivative of or simply inferior to its European, particularly French counterparts. The loosening of geographic and stylistic categories in the reinstallation enabled unforeseen interactions to unfold. On one wall, a well-known work by Jean Dubuffet, Woman Grinding Coffee, you see on the right, partnered with Hirshfield's Little Scene painting, Little Scene to that time, painting Stage Beauties, which had been donated to the museum by Carol and Donna Janis in 2013. And I believe this was its inaugural display at the museum. The pairing offered wildly divergent views of figuration, frontality, and femaleness unfolding on different continents at nearly the same moment, 44 and 45. It coupled a canonical modernist with a little-known self-taught artist. In Stage Beauties, which is in the show, you could see it today. If you're in New York, please go see it if you haven't. It's a great painting, in my view. In Stage Beauties, a dazzle of color and patterns showcase a trio of female performers. Each of the beauties has been outfitted in a boldly striped costume that both rhymes and contrasts with those of her companions. And you can see the yellow and green stripes, the blue and white, the blue and yellow stripes, and the red and yellow, and the sort of charming way in which each outfit is coordinated, but also distinguished from from the companion, the outfits worn by any one dancers, the other two companions. Okay. The longer one looks at the painting, the stranger and more delightful it becomes. While the women's faces are presented and torsos are presented frontally, they're presented frontally, their legs are turned in sharp profile. There is simply no way, anatomically speaking, to reconcile their upper and lower halves. The costumes worn by the showgirls do not so much resolve this problem as distract from it by becoming their own spectacle of sartorial improbability. Dresses extend into semi-flaccid sausage-shaped tails. The red and yellow headdress of one figure on the right is accessorized with a pair of antennae. In contrast to Stage Beauties, Dubuffet's Woman Grinding Coffee presses the female figure against and nearly grinds her into the molten brown, tar-thick ground of the picture. Widened to encompass nearly the entirety of the canvas, the figure is both cursorily drawn and crudely distorted. Her moon face is smeared and abraded by brown pigment. Her pigtails resemble nothing so much as bloated feet, the right one with a detached big toe. A harsh terrain of craggy, irregular ruts and sludgy, I don't know what, I can't, anyways, sludgy forms make, as Dubuffet put it, a monument to the beauty of dirt, trash, and filth. When I visited the museum in 2015, I'm sorry about the odd, anyway, the patterns, the sunlight on me. When I visited the museum in 2015, I spent time with both the Hirshfield and Dubuffet, among many other pictures. As I was about to leave the galleries, I was drawn back to stage beauties. Something on the surface of the painting was creating a glimmer or sparkle of light. The glint seemed to emerge from the eyes of the female figures, the beauties, particularly the central one. As I could not understand how this effect was produced, and it's not captured by the reproduction, but as I could not understand how it was produced, I approached the picture more closely to determine whether there was some other material, a bit of glitter perhaps, a splinter of silver leaf or foil embedded in it. I could not, however, find anything but oil paint. As I moved yet nearer to the picture to scrutinize its brushwork and texture, I sensed the increasing concern of a nearby museum guard. After a few minutes, she firmly asked me to step back from the work. I complied. I had been going to the Metropolitan Museum for decades, had even worked there for a year, but had never seen a picture by Hirshfield nor heard his name mentioned. I had not, in fact, seen a painting by the artist in person anywhere prior to this moment. The mistake in my encounter with stage beauties was not my failure to locate the source of its glimmer, nor my improper nearness to the canvas. The mistake was in how long it had taken me to see a painting by Hirshfield. The mistake was not of my own making, or at least not exclusively so, but that of art history. Even as I left the Metropolitan Museum, I was still captivated by stage beauties and the difference it posed to the narratives of modern art I had been taught. I wanted to be part of that difference. The glint in the eyes of the central figure in the painting was also a spark. It helped convince me that Hirshfield's art deserved more attention. Both a book and museum show came out of that conviction. Okay, now my second moment of unlikely partnership. The distinction between self-taught artists such as Hirshfield and avant-garde art was not as severely policed in the 1930s and 40s as it would be in subsequent decades, which is to say, the Metropolitan's reinstallation was something of a throwback to an earlier moment, and I think a very exciting and complicated moment in the understanding of modern art. In 1941, the Museum of Modern Art presented a new installation of its permanent collection. I'm going to just try that. Okay. While the museum's storied collection had been on display in one version or another virtually ever since it was founded, while it has been on display in one version or another virtually ever since, such exhibitions, large displays of the permanent collection that were themselves semi-permanent as displays, were not a museum convention at the time. We often take this for granted nowadays, but it wasn't always the case. But this was the first attempt at an install of the permanent collection. Prior to viewing works by Gauguin, Cézanne, Matisse, and Picasso, visitors entered a gallery devoted to modern primitives, artists of the people, and I'm showing that to you on the left. 18 non-professional self-taught painters from France, Britain, and the United States were represented by their work, including John Kane, whose self-portrait you see on the far wall, Henri Rousseau, whose gypsy you see on that same wall, Joseph Pickett, and many other, William Edmondson, other artists, including among the paintings on display were 10 newly acquired works of self-taught art, including Hirshfield's Tiger and Girl in a Mirror. So if you were to flip this image around so you could see this wall, on the far right would be Tiger. I couldn't resist showing it to you in color. Again, it's on the walls for the moment at the American Folk Art Museum. Please go see it if you haven't. It's, as Alfred Barr says, one of the most said the most unforgettable animal painting in 20th century art, or one of the most. And then next to that is another Hirshfield nude, nude in the mirror. And so the idea that you would see these paintings first in order to better understand what artists like Picasso or Mondrian were doing, I think is very remote from the separation of folk from modernist art that that has come to often define our understanding of this period, if folk art, so-called folk art, is referenced at all, other than from an earlier moment, the turn of the 20th century, Rousseau, who's very often referenced. But all of the other artists you see on the wall, including Hirshfield, have been largely obscured in the story of modern art, definitely as it's told at MoMA, and at other so-called mainstream or modern art museums. And that's one of the crucial roles of AFAM, which is in complicating and expanding that story and harking back to the way it was earlierly understood in an earlier moment and displayed it, and in some ways savored. Okay, so I'm going to go to a third. I'm sort of quickening the pace of our dance here, of our changing partners. And this one has to do with Mondrian, obviously, and Hirshfield. You're seeing Broadway Boogie Woogie on the right, and Girl at the window, also known as Hot Night in July, on the left. So Sidney Janis, who just would go on to become world famous dealer, but in the early 1940s was a curator, a self-taught art historian, collector, and he was the discoverer of Morris Hirshfield. I think you'll hear more about this from my colleague and co-creator of Master of the Two Left Feet, the book, and of the show, Susan Davidson. And this is an anecdote that Janis liked to tell about Mondrian coming to his apartment on the upper, right off of Fifth Avenue, and coming to look at the collection shortly after Mondrian arrived in New York, the collection owned by the Janises, Sidney and his wife Harriet, who's very extensively involved, although didn't always get the credit for both the collection and the publications that Janis and the Janises wrote. So Mondrian, this is Janis speaking, despite the restricted regime of his own art, was noted for his quick response to originality, however different, in other painters. Not long after his arrival from abroad, he selected from a group of paintings by leading international avant-garde artists, including his own work, a painting by an artist unknown to him, remarking, "Excepting Picasso, this is the strongest picture here." It was a painting, this one, by Morris Hirshfield. And just so to make clear, at the time, among the works owned and probably displayed at that moment by the Janises were a De Chirico, several clays, I believe at least one Leger, or there was one Leger, but I think perhaps more than one, Rousseau's The Gypsy and Dali, as well as Mondrian himself. So Mondrian actually, with typical humility, points to Hirshfield, first Picasso, but then Hirshfield rather than Mondrian himself as making the strongest painting. At this point, he didn't know who Hirshfield was. He just picked the painting out. Hirshfield, end quote, Hirshfield would unquestionably have agreed with this point of view, but he did not in turn prove receptive to Mondrian's art. At the opening of his own exhibition at MoMA, Hirshfield, noticing a picture hanging in the museum foyer, inquired to Janis about it. And because now Hirshfield didn't know who the artist was. It was, as Janis noted, Mondrian's Broadway Boogie Woogie. When Hirshfield learned the painting had recently been purchased by the museum, he was incredulous. Janice quotes him as saying in astonishment, "They paid money for that?" The visionary abstract artist, Mondrian, recognizes the originality of the self-taught painter and former slipper salesman. Hirshfield, by contrast, is baffled that MoMA should acquire a painting such as Broadway Boogie Woogie. The judgment of history has, of course, been just the reverse. Mondrian not only belongs to MoMA, but the history of modern art cannot be told without him. Hirshfield, by contrast, has been largely invisible within canonical accounts of modernist art since the 1940s. And his MoMA owns 8 of his most engaging, dazzling paintings, 6 of which are on view in the retrospective very generously of MoMA, until quite recently, until the pandemic actually, when 3 paintings by Hirshfield were shown in a gallery called Masters of Popular Painting, which is the title of a 1938 major show at MoMA. These paintings were largely in storage since 1943, which was the date of Hirshfield's ill-fated one-man show at the Museum of Modern Art.
Richard, it's time to wrap up, please. Thank you.
Sorry?
It's time to wrap up. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I'll just show this and not talk about it right now. I believe Susan will talk about the MoMA show and especially the controversy over it. Alfred Barr was fired within 2 months, in part because of the bad taste that the show supposedly, according to members of the Board of Trustees, especially Stephen Clark, felt that the show represented. Okay. So my final moment, one of the things that was very important to me in doing this show was to figure out how to bring Hirshfield's creativity before he was an artist to view, and to get away from the idea that it's only when he picked up paint and brushes at the age of 65 that he became inventive and imaginative. And I was especially interested in the slipper designs, the boudoir slippers he had made, many of which were patented. I was also interested in the fact that Sidney Janis had started out as a ballroom dancer on the vaudeville circuit. He's with his partner, Grace McCann. He never achieved the visibility of Fred and his then partner, Adele, his sister, Esther. But nevertheless, he would be known throughout his career as a dealer, as also this extremely smooth dancer and elegant dancer. And I talk about how he was that metaphor in terms of his smooth maneuvering of the New York art world. So I didn't know how to make Hirshfield's slippers, his designs, all that we have from them are the patent illustrations. I didn't know how to make them come alive until it occurred to me, maybe an artist or someone could make the slippers in 3 dimensions. And I looked around, I couldn't find anyone to do it. And finally, I found Liz Blood, an artist interested in shoes, who said not only would she do it, but she became absolutely dedicated to the project and ended up creating 14 different slippers, which have been a huge hit at the exhibition. Okay, Mathilde, this is my last paragraph, 2 paragraphs. Liz's beautiful slippers became for me a metaphor for what I think art historians at their best might do. We return to the past. We return to the past in order to make it come alive in the present. A number of visitors, Morris Hirshfield's slippers are not irrelevant to his paintings, as we hope viewers see by the juxtaposition of the slippers to the later pictures in which flamboyantly stylized footwear and female bodies appear. But it is not just about visual resemblance. Making the slippers today asks people to think about Hirshfield's life as a maker 100 years ago. A number of visitors have asked me where they can buy a pair of the slippers. My response is always the same. There are no pairs. There's only one slipper per design. and they are not for sale. These slippers have been made by a contemporary artist, Liz Blad, in response to the creative vision of another artist, Morris Hirshfield. But he wasn't an artist yet, at least according to art history. I realize this answer is slightly confusing, but I think it's appropriate. I'm asking visitors to move beyond the mental habit, which is mine as well, of viewing desirable objects through the lens of potential acquisition. This, of course, is the lens through which Hirshfield hopes his low-heeled, relatively inexpensive felt slippers would be seen. They were made to sell. Now, however, the slippers are made to be looked at rather than purchased, to be seen as visual and material designs worthy of attention in their own right. Changing habits of looking, like changing partners, is not a simple process. And as Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers, Morris Hirshfield, and Liz Blad demonstrate, finding the right footwear to do it may be an art in itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, and sorry for rushing you at the end. We have a very tight schedule today. Thank you also, Jason, to setting the stage for today's program. Without further ado, I would like to kick off the first session of the symposium. Just a quick note on sequencing, if I can have the slide of the schedule, Richard.
Wait, I'm going to stop sharing.
Yes, I think you did stop sharing.
You're talking to the other Richard.
I need the other Richard, sorry.
I'm sorry, I'm going to mute.
Yes, thank you so much. So we will hear from Jennifer Marshall, followed by Brooke Wyatt, and then Susan Davidson will be closing our first session. Please do submit your question in the Q&A feature. There will be time for questions at the end of the session, and we will make every effort to get to as many as possible. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Esther Adler, our moderator for session 1, titled Modern Primitives, which focuses on the Museum of Modern Art's program of exhibitions and acquisition in the 30s, early 40s, and the inclusion of many self-taught artists in this pluralistic program. Esther will be introducing the topic and the speaker of this first segment. Esther Adler is curator in the Department of Drawings and Prints at the Museum of Modern Art. Most recently, she organized Joseph Joachim, What I Saw, which was shown at MoMA last year. Please give a warm welcome to Esther Adler.
Thank you so much, Mathilde, and thank you to everyone at the American Folk Art Museum for inviting me to participate. I loved the Hirshfield show. I encourage everyone to see it before it closes. And I will also say, should there be, as much as I appreciate Richard's argument about looking rather than buying, should there be an opportunity in the future to produce those gorgeous slippers for purchase, I would absolutely be an eager customer. So I'm very happy to be hosting this first panel. It focuses, as Mathilde mentioned, very much on a number of exhibitions that were held at the institution at which I work, the Museum of Modern Art. And each of the speakers will focus on a different artist who was then featured in a various exhibition at the museum. And so with this in mind, I thought it might be useful to bring ourselves back to the moment in which those exhibitions happened. So our speakers will be talking about William Edmondson, Seraphine Louis, and Morris Hirshfield. But I think we'll also be looking at the critical framework, which was both celebratory and problematic, that MoMA created around the artists and their work. I think Richard referred to it as an excited and complicated time, which I think is right on the nose. So I thought I would start by sharing one of my favorite images from the MoMA archive. So this is a picture of our dapper young director, Alfred Barr, at center. And he's with the president of Nicaragua at the time and his daughter, and they were visiting the museum. This is clearly a staged press photo, and it's accompanied by an equally press-related caption. And it was a photo that was taken in 1939 at the time of the museum's 10th anniversary and the opening of its first bespoke building space. It was also the time the World's Fair was happening in New York. And so what work of art are they standing by? It's not a Picasso, it's not a Brancusi, both of which were on view elsewhere in the building, but rather it's a 5.5-foot tall wooden eagle, one that was purportedly made for a Rhode Island tavern. For this to have been the backdrop for the photograph of our director and a world leader is telling about the way that MoMA positioned itself, both itself and also what it termed at that time American folk and popular art. The work was not a curiosity, but rather a fundamental part of the story, as we called it then and now, of the art of our time. There's, of course, also all kinds of interesting and problematic political and other overtones to this image, but perhaps a topic for a different symposium. So if MoMA was the place to see modern European masters like Cézanne, Gauguin, Seurat, and Van Gogh, and here just an installation view from our inaugural exhibition, which included all of those artists, we were also the place to see paintings like this image on the right, the iconic Baby in Red Chair, which was shown at the museum 3 years later in an exhibition titled American Folk Art, the Art of the Common Man in America, 1750 to 1900. Not only was this work exhibited at MoMA, but in 1939, it was officially accepted into the museum's collection. And this and other works of folk art and work by self-taught artists were installed in 1941, as Richard mentioned, in a new installation of our collection. These were the first works that one encountered when you entered the museum's collection. And I have this quote from Alfred Barr here, just to give you a sense of how those things were positioned. The modern primitives have been chosen to open the series of new galleries for 2 reasons. First, because with the 10 new acquisitions, it is the finest and most representative group of its kind in any museum in the world. And secondly, because it seems the best introduction to a general survey of modern painting, such as the museum collection will eventually present, end quote. I think this is an extraordinary and celebratory statement. If only it had been indicative of a long-term commitment to this kind of work on its own terms. But of course, why was the museum so interested in this kind of work even then? Because, and here another quote from Barr, as he explained from around the same time to a patron, folk or popular paintings and sculpture are more or less the discovery of modern artists, end quote. This work then was of interest to the museum because it was of interest to the contemporary artists that it championed. This isn't a problem unto itself. Curators then and now are still introduced to great works of art all the time by other artists we know. It becomes a problem, though, if our interest and looking at this work is solely through the lens of other artists, of the collectors or the supporters of the museum who also champion them. And so this is an issue that the museum has really grappled with throughout its history. Consider, for example, the broad range of works from other cultures that were also exhibited at MoMA during this period. Here on the left, an installation of our show, American Sources of Modern Art, Aztec, Mayan, and Incan from 1933, the infamous African Negro Art exhibition from 1935, and last but not least, Indian Art of the United States in 1941. So I think we're fortunate to have arrived at a moment where we can be self-critical about the circumstances in which these works were shown, but also to continue the celebratory tone of them, but now with a new focus on the agency and contribution of their makers. And so with that in mind, I'm thrilled to introduce today's panelists. Jennifer Jane Marshall is professor and chair in art history at the University of Minnesota. She is the author of Machine Art, 1934, an examination of the Museum of Modern Art's landmark exhibition of industrial design. It was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2012 and also a recipient of the Daedalus Foundation's Robert Motherwell Book Award. She is currently working on a highly anticipated monograph on William Edmondson, and today she will be speaking to us on that sculptor's 1937 exhibition at MoMA. Brooke Wyatt is the Luce Assistant Curator at the American Folk Art Museum, where she is currently working on a series of exhibitions drawn from the museum's collection. Brooke's doctoral dissertation is titled Séraphine Louis and French Self-Taught Artist and French Self-Taught Art in Transatlantic Modernist Discourse. And we're thrilled that she will be talking to us about Séraphine Louis today. And finally, Susan Davidson is an art historian and was the curatorial advisor to the American Folk Art Museum on the current exhibition, Morris Hirshfield Rediscovered. She is also the author of the invaluable catalog of works that is a portion of that exhibition's publication. So after Jennifer, Brooke, and Susan present, we'll gather together for questions both from each other and also from the audience. And so with that, I'm happy to welcome Jennifer to the screen.
Thanks so much, Esther. I am going to share screen before doing my thank yous. Like so, does this feel correct?
Looks great.
Great, thank you for the confirmation. And thank you everyone for being here, and to Mathilde and Richard and Susan and all the friends and heroes that are on today's program of events, talking about American modernism and American folk art in the years between the wars is sort of a dream come true and a life's work. So this is a real pleasurable day. And you can see on my slide here how to reach me. I'm easy to find at the University of Minnesota and happy to engage these conversations in today's conversations and Q&A, but also beyond that. If you've ever learned anything about the Museum of Modern Art's early years during the 1930s or about its first director, Alfred Barr, you've certainly seen this image already. Made for MoMA's 1936 exhibition, Cubism and Abstract Art, this chart tries to outline modern art in a way that clarifies its internal relationships, its change over time, and patterns of influence or dissent. And yes, the chart has a scientific feel. It behaves something like Darwin's The Descent of Man, but for the avant-garde, like Darwin's phylogenetic tree of life, but applied to MoMA's primary educational goal, to teach urban and suburban, well-educated, largely white middle-class Americans how to untangle and maybe even appreciate what otherwise looked to a lot of people more like a mess. As scholars before me have noticed, and I've also had occasion to write about, Barr approached his work as MoMA's first director and chief curator, much like a natural scientist. He collected specimens from the vast international phenomenon known as modern art, organized them according to shared visual characteristics, and from all this, he made a genealogical model of modern art, a reconception of its seemingly bizarre isms as inherently emergent artistic values, as the result of something like natural selection. Modern art was as though it had been revealed to Barr's scholarly analysis, as though discovered by his curatorial eye. At least that was the put on of charts like these. And you see him going through some drafts on the screen now. And by 1936, it should be said, the family tree approach was not only a Darwinian nod, but part of a larger sort of cliche, if not even arch or cynical joke about how to sort the isms, how to chart their lineages. One of the goals for us today, as I see it, and one of the achievements of an exhibition like Morris Hirshfield Rediscovered, is to make good on the opportunity to review museums as just one site among many in which modern arts values are made, not discovered, manufactured rather than just classified, and crucially, creatively and socially produced, rather than passively, naturally reproduced or handed down. An opportunity to see MoMA and the New York art world as just one art world among many. I think we all think of art in this way already, but I'm using my emphatic voice here because to review art as something produced is a potentially powerful way to dislodge the reproductive imagination at the heart of culture's biological metaphors, its scientific imagination. And so also by this shift, we might help shake art history loose from its dreams even of purity, even biological, or we might say racial purity, and acknowledge with them the nightmares of racist violence. So let's swap in a map for the tree. It would have been by rail. We're seeing a railway map of the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railway, though a bit in advance of the period we're discussing today. But it would have been by rail lines like these that 31 limestone sculptures by William Edmondson made their way from Nashville to Manhattan in New York during the summer of 1937. The show, you're seeing a still from a newsreel that featured the exhibition from 37 here, like so. A few more stills from that newsreel, as well as a current view of the bride who's being appraised by this museum goer at upper right. This show at MoMA featured 12 works by the Tennessee artist. Not quite half of these portrayed contemporary types. 3 of these were female forms, like here, as well as woman with bustle, a lady in cloak, and this one with the gloved fists, known as bride. The 2 male forms on view were exhibited as lawyer and preacher. You see it here in the far left margin of this film still. The lawyer and preacher are common terms for all of Edmondson's figures of orating men, sometimes used interchangeably for these dapper folks with long tails and a book held under an arm. These genre figures appeared in Manhattan as though carved from life by Edmondson as he observed it in his Nashville neighborhood. And this feeling of everyday America would have played well at MoMA in 1937. During the same season as Edmondson's run, they hung an exhibition of American scene regionalist painting, hosted the debut of Selznick's Technicolor Tom Sawyer, displayed film stills from Griffith's Birth of a Nation, and showed Lester Beale's posters for the New Deal rural electrification program. And to back up a bit here, you're seeing these male figures in Edmondson's yard, documented by the photographer Louise Dahl-Wolf, who we'll meet in a second. You're also seeing an early Sanborn map of the neighborhood where Edmondson worked in Nashville. You see by 1914, he'd not yet built his home, which he owned and was adjacent to his mother's home in a part of Nashville that's just about not quite a mile to the east of Vanderbilt University. And it's this sort of southernness that is elsewhere referenced at MoMA in 1937 and elsewhere dealt with by the New Deal administration, the Rural Electrification Administration. 2 works in the MoMA show. We come back to these general views: a ticket taker, museum goers, and doves, as seen here in contemporary photography. 2 works in the show portrayed animals, this set of mourning doves, which were part of Edmondson's work as a monument maker for cemeteries, and a resting ram, perhaps like this one. He made dozens. These works were not mere animalia, but theologically allegorical forms. This was apparent to viewers, at least those who were taking notes of the titles, and who may have taken note of the title of this monument. It's long been known as Noah's Ark and was at the 37 show, and we have reason to believe that the name came from Edmondson himself, since it doesn't otherwise conform to the boat shape we might expect, and since we know that Edmondson performed with this particular object for the benefit of the camera. And I'm sorry, I don't have that slide. The last 4 objects, as we come to here, it sort of emphasize this theme of Edmondson's religiosity that began perhaps with the Noah's Ark hint. It may have been in pursuit of this theme of religiosity that helped the museums pick their 12 objects from the 31 that were sent north. And this theme, too, embroidered the same Southern sentiment elsewhere on view in the museum's galleries in the fall of 37. Rounding out sculpture by William Edmondson was also an angel, a crucifixion, as you see here, and 2 versions of a New Testament story to which Edmondson frequently returned. Here is the American Folk Art Museum's version of what we see from the film still up at right. This is Mary and Martha, which the artist always showed to be 2 women identically inclined at rest, which is notably at variance with the parable. MoMA exhibited 2 of these forms, one of which they'd shipped to Paris the next year as part of its 300 Centuries of American Art show. And perhaps their curatorial preference for the motif in the 37 installation stemmed from how this pair of Mary and Martha from the Bible hit the exhibition's core theme of everyday life, dressed as though for Sunday services in Tennessee, and Christian piety hard. In this way, the exhibition helped manufacture what has since been received as the major motifs of Edmondson's oeuvre, the religious and allegorical, and the here and now. If any of this sweet blend was at all meant to feel elegiac or archaic, MoMA's Towns of Tomorrow preview, also on view in the fall of 37, a preview of the coming 39 World's Fair, would have sharpened the point. Edmondson's world, like Tom Benton's or Tom Sawyer's, was passing away. Indeed, the very spaces in which Edmondson's hand-carved works were viewed, and the very people who viewed them, we can recall these smartly dressed museum goers, would have made the contrast between Edmondson's world and Manhattan all the sharper. Sculpture by William Edmondson was not installed in MoMA's original brownstone, nor did it appear in the Goodwin Stone International Style showpiece, building that opened in 1939. Instead, staged between October and December of 37, sculpture by William Edmondson went up in MoMA's temporary quarters in the mezzanine level of one of the buildings at Rockefeller Center, one of the new constructions you see Beaumont Newhall documenting in the photograph at right. This put William Edmondson on the calendar of a larger transitional phase for MoMA, characterized not only by its headquarters upgrade, but by a strategic report drafted by Artemis Packard and funded by Nelson Rockefeller. The Packard report called for a more populist approach to modern art, and with it, bigger audiences. I'll let you meet the artist behind the works. All of the 31 works that had been crated up and moved to Manhattan during the late summer of 37 had been rather recently made. William Edmondson had only just started carving sculpture a few years prior. He'd taken up stone carving as an avocation at midlife. This after retiring from a wage-earning career spent mostly in custodial positions, including at Nashville Women's Hospital, Pay What You Can clinic, run by women that provided women's health services on a sliding scale to patients, many of whom traveled from out of state. Edmondson described his turn to art making as the result of a religious calling. He spoke of pictures hung in the sky and his ease at making them permanent in stone. He spoke of angels in his house, Jesus sitting at the foot of his bed, the voice of his heavenly daddy, and again to any white reporter or patron who would ask, he spoke of the artistic gift that God had given him. Never once did Edmondson defame that gift with false modesty or self-deprecation or apparent doubt. Even given what I've said about sentimentality, I take Edmondson at his word in these matters, or at least I understand the sentimentality to have been manufactured at least in part by him. Edmondson's art-making visions came at a felicitous historical moment, a time of widespread urban revitalization thanks to Roosevelt's New Deal and its work relief programs, part of a technocratic effort at modernization of which Town of Tomorrow was a part. This effort benefited Edmondson indirectly in the form of freely gotten art supplies. All the limestone architectural scrap that was churned up or discarded from Tennessee's dozens of building projects became civic surplus, much of which found its way to Edmondson's ample yard. Because he worked with found materials and cut his art directly from them, Edmondson's practice put him within a modernist context that MoMA embraced for contemporary sculpture at the same time. The practice aligned him specifically with the direct carving movement, representative works of which were all also on view at MoMA in that fall of 37. So along with Thomas Hart Benton, with D.W. Griffiths, we had not only Edmondson, but also Henry Moore, Isamu Noguchi, and here Chaim Gross. All of these had pedestals that season and would have paired nicely with the Edmondson works for any wandering visitor eager to connect some dots. But how did sculpture by William Edmondson come to get assembled in the first place? It's dispiritingly predictable how the show would eventually be framed and received that year, how it would appear in the popular media as somewhat of a gee whiz fish out of water story. MoMA's press releases set the tone for this, absolutely, with language characterizing the artist as someone who had never seen a work of sculpture except his own, who was touched and simple, who was illiterate and eager for praise. And the ensuing press clippings were equally acquiescent to a stereotyped view of Edmondson. But the lifespan and cultural significance of an art exhibit, much like the lifespan and cultural significance of an artwork, begins long before its completion and public debut. What forces and coincidences and broad social assemblages had to happen for sculpture by William Edmondson to have its MoMA run? The standard story about this is true, even if it leaves out a number of important details that I'm going to expand on. The most told story centers on the photographer Louise Dahl Wolff, and it was she who put it so flatly in 1969, "I'm the one that got the show." Here you see her not quite 50 years later with her husband, the Tennessean Mike Wolff, Meyer Wolff by birth. Meet Louise Dahl Wolff. An aspiring art and fashion photographer in 1937, she had taken a series of photographs of Edmondson while visiting her in-laws in Tennessee. That's Mike's family. She later showed those pictures to Carmel Snow, then newly appointed editor of Harper's Bazaar. Snow agreed with Dahl Wolff that the pictures and the story together would make good content at the magazine, but the idea was quickly scuttled by Harper's publisher, William Randolph Hearst, who wouldn't allow it, as Dahl Wolff later recounted, because of his terrible prejudice about Black people. If not Harper's, what would be the right venue for introducing Edmondson's talents to sophisticates? Disappointed, but Dahl Wolff pressed on. I showed them to Tom Mabry. So meet Tom Mabry. Here you see him photographed by the socialite and Harlem hanger-on, Carl Van Vechten. Van Vechten remembered Mabry as one of the famous beauties of the 20th century, but Mabry is maybe little remembered in MoMA's institutional mythology. He served as the museum's executive director in the mid-30s, taking over the role from Alan Blackburn, who had rather publicly resigned from the museum at the end of 1934. His departure claimed more than a few headlines because he packed up with Philip Johnson in a brand new Packard and set out to drive from Manhattan to Louisiana in search of an acolyte's roost at Huey Long's right hand. If Blackburn and Johnson's fascist populist leanings carried them south from New York, it might be said that Mabry's democratic cosmopolitan leanings carried him upward and opposite along a similar route. In fact, he'd been back and forth between the Middle South and the Yankee North throughout his early adulthood. A bachelor's degree at Harvard, followed by a master's degree at Vanderbilt. Then the MoMA job came after a 2-year administrative post as assistant to the president of Fisk University in Nashville. Now, Mabry's employment at the country's most prestigious Black university didn't come from nowhere. It was part of a pattern of the Clarksville, Tennessee native who frequently crossed the color line in his activities in pursuit of both higher learning and arts and letters. This is surely part of what brought him into Van Vechten's orbit, and not just the brooding brow and strong jawline. Before his post at MoMA, Mabry had multiple points of connection to the Black artistic milieus of both New York and Nashville. He had worked for Alfred and Blanche Knopf, the publishers who'd supported so many of Harlem's literati. He was friends with Walter White, the head of the NAACP, and he had a secret but passionate love affair with Nella Larson, best known for her 1929 novel, Passing. During his grad school days at Vanderbilt, Mabry had agitated to get James Weldon Johnson on his thesis committee. Johnson, the sociologist and poet who wrote the lyrics to Lift Every Voice and Sing, this is him, again in a portrait by the white photographer Van Vechten, had a faculty post at Fisk, but was not permitted to sit on Mabry's committee among the all-white faculty. Mabry's petition was then an activist petition made with the expectation of failure. Some of this spirit may have been behind a party Mabry once threw. In an attempt to recreate the interracial cultural foment he had enjoyed in New York City, he invited a crew of intellectuals to his family cabin outside Nashville. It did not go well. The guest list, which included not only James Weldon Johnson, but also Langston Hughes and Vanderbilt's white advisors, and Mabry's white advisors from Vanderbilt, got Mabry, as he'd later recall, nearly thrown out. I was goddamn sore. All of this would seem to have equipped him especially well to Louise Dahl-Wolf's pitch on behalf of Edmondson, and it must have, since he used her photographs, all enlarged and lovely, as she would later boast, to circulate the idea around to MoMA's curators and secure the exhibition. But Mabry himself didn't have any particular connection to Edmondson or any prior knowledge of his work. This, even though Fisk's campus, where he'd worked, was only 2.5 miles north of Edmondson's Nashville home and studio, and even though his employment there exactly coincided with Edmondson's ascendance to art making. Indeed, Mabry's seemingly distracted disinterest in Edmondson has been his biggest legacy in the secondary literature on the sculptor. In a memo he drafted on the topic of the show, he refers multiple times to William, but ends the note by asking, one hopes with chagrin, what is William's last name? There's even less paper trail to illustrate Alfred Barr's investment in the exhibition, although he did supply some language for the press release praising the sculptor's directness of approach, a nod perhaps to the direct carving movement. So then, aside from Mabry, I would count Dorothy C. Miller as the most important MoMA curator behind the wheel of sculpture by William Edmondson. As she put it in 1968, I remember our little Edmondson exhibition vividly since I installed it. Here she is. She's the one in the especially good hat at center. In this photo, she's seated between Elizabeth Catlett and Charles White, the husband and wife artists who were featured as part of MoMA's partnership with the Harmon Foundation in 1943. Dorothy Miller herself was part of a powerhouse coupling attached to Holger Cahill, who was behind MoMA's first American folk art exhibition in 1932, the exhibition that brought the eagle and the baby in chair into the museum's walls. Miller herself began her career at MoMA as an assistant curator in 1934, and she'd go on to have nearly a 35-year career at the institution. Few others more than Miller took the work of culture broker more seriously. When Edmondson was rediscovered in the late 1960s, Miller served as a living Rolodex, connecting researchers to the many collectors and artists who had purchased works by the sculptor in the 1930s, but kept this dispersed collection out of public view. Miller enjoyed pointing people to Betty Parsons, for example, who kept some Edmondson doves on her desk at her gallery. In her recollection of the Edmondson show, Miller underscored the point of its smallness. I'm sorry, she said too, that we did not buy an Edmondson sculpture, but at that point, I think all the best examples were sold. Indeed, MoMA served as a point of sale for approximately 10 sculptures. Mabry bought one, so did MoMA President A. Conger Goodyear and Millard Neese, the art historian. Dahl-Wolf ended up keeping the rest, displaying some at her home with the artist, with her husband, Mike. This country house in New Jersey they called the Creamery was later featured in House Beautiful. You see an Edmondson, Mary and Martha there, a different one. Dahl-Wolf did none of this alone. Neither, of course, did Miller. While Dahl-Wolf's photos worked as a vehicle and Miller's expertise worked as a conduit, all of this was acting on behalf of Edmondson and as part of a larger team of white artists and culture brokers and curators who had developed a relationship with the sculptor and wanted to see to it that he got his due. Mathilde, can I ask for time?
So it's time to wrap up. Thank you for asking.
Oh yeah, that's fine. There are other stories, which I am eager to talk about always. But let's But because there are so many stories, there's story after story about which I could say more and more. I could tell you about Edmondson's sister, Sarah, who took in laundry at home and kept working while he began carving. They cohabitated throughout their adult life. His friend, Sidney Hirsch, who brought him to the attention of Louise Dahl-Wolf and Mike Wolf. All of these stories are knit together by blocks, by pedestrian pathways through central Nashville. All of these stories make up the exhibition and how it got to be assembled. And in all of these stories, some of which I've told, some which I've teased, I'm trying to emphasize that modernism is a set of emergent practices born from social movement. With all of this busyness of activity, I'm probably running a little afoul of what Edmondson himself would have said about these arrangements of accident. None of this was fated to happen. And with this emphasis, I'm running afoul too of both Edmondson's religious artistic practice, carving, cutting away as though art merely awaited his chisel, and of Barr's scientific curatorial practice, classifying, arranging, demonstrating, as though art merely came to him by natural selection. I'm insisting instead that modern art's forms and values, and that a brief event of 12 sculptures called Sculpture by William Edmondson, all happened just because of the accidents and connections, conscious decisions, friendships, and parties that are all born of social actions and human decision-making. It's an obvious conclusion, and that's maybe the best kind, because I'm hoping that a reminder of the constant activity by which art is produced might help shake loose the last remnants of genealogical models of art history and might finally deracinate the family tree that comes with them. With a new map in place, may we be reminded of the conscious work, social relationships, and duties that drive the art world's movements and ever-emerging modernisms. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, and hopefully successfully enter into presenter mode. Okay, how is?
Looks good.
The image? Okay. Okay, so thank you first to Jennifer Marshall and to all of the organizers, moderators, and presenters. It is an honor to join you today in the company of so many scholars and curators whose work has inspired and shaped my own. My presentation looks closely at the work of the French self-taught painter, Seraphine Louis, whose signature is pictured on the right. Louis consistently signed her paintings S. Louis, sometimes adding a flourishing tail accentuating the final S in her surname, as seen here. I will consider Louis' role as the only woman included in the 1938 MoMA exhibition, Masters of Popular Painting, Modern Primitives of Europe and America. Masters of Popular Painting combined a European, mostly French, contingent with a cadre of North American, mostly US artists. Seraphine Louis' role in Masters, as well as the show's origins in France, have yet to be fully unpacked for the insights that both provide about the essential contributions of self-taught artists during the interwar period and beyond to what we now study as modern and contemporary art. Okay. Okay. Can everyone see the next slide now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so let's begin with a painting from circa 1930, Seraphine Louis' Feuilles Claires, whose title can be translated as clear or bright leaves. The art historian Anne Wagner asserts that artworks exist as the material site of the artist's voice in the context of her work on Eva Hesse, Lee Krasner, and Georgia O'Keeffe, 3 artists, 3 women. The stakes of voice, agency, and representation take on even greater urgency in the field of self-taught art, where artists and their works are too often spoken for. For example, the title of the painting we are looking at, Feuilles Claires, did not originate with the artist herself, but was bestowed by art world insiders who collected, exhibited, and marketed her work. In Fléclair and across her oeuvre, Louis deploys intricate systems of brushwork, creating complex spatial interpretations of botanical forms, rendered in a proprietary blend of pigments, oil paints, and household enamel. The product of a sustained and innovative studio practice, Louis' work has received uneven critical treatment and has often been overshadowed by an over-reliance on mythicized biography. Louis was born in 1864 in a village in the Oise region of France, north of Paris. After working as a housekeeper in a convent for 2 decades, at the turn of the century, around the age of 40, she took up residence in the town of Senlis, supporting herself by cleaning houses and embarking on the production of a body of work that she developed across decades, an endeavor she pursued continuously until 1932, when she was committed to the psychiatric hospital where she would spend the rest of her life. Masters of Popular Painting, Modern Primitives of Europe and America, opened at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in April 1938, and was hailed by founding director Alfred Barr as the 3rd installment in a series of movement and institution-defining exhibitions that began with Cubism and abstract art in 1936 and continued with fantastic art, Dada, Surrealism the same year. Throughout the run of Masters of Popular Painting, Louis was interned in the psychiatric hospital where she had been confined since 1932. Staged on the eve of war in Europe, Masters both reflected and advanced discursive categories of folk, quote, primitive, and quote, naive art that had evolved during the interwar period. Now to look closely at the paintings by Séraphine Louis that were shown in New York in 1938. In Bouquet de Fruits, Louis' engagement with the edges of the picture plane is notable, as is her experimental treatment of the basket or vessel that seems superfluous in its containment of the swirl of stylized leaves and voluminous fruits. The work's modulated background is shadowy, suggestive, as a band of darker color indicates the surface. With exacting consistency, Louis signed her paintings with the name S. Louis, observable here at the upper right, where its shape echoes the curvature of the surrounding foliage. The artistic agency demonstrated by Louis' signature practice was historically sidelined by the critics, collectors, and curators who established the convention of referring to the artist as Séraphine Senlis. Such evocations of the medieval history of the town where Louis lived and worked continues to hold sway in the present, as do references to the artist using only her first name, Séraphine. This latter naming convention links Louis to fabled painters of the early Renaissance, while also invoking the connection between her name and biblical seraphs, casting her as an otherworldly, even angelic figure. Such practices in the US and French contexts reinforce Louis' status as an outsider to conventional norms of artistic subjectivity, as do the litany of terms such as naive and primitive ascribed to artists such as Louis, for whom, due to the intersections of such markers as class, race, gender, and ability, formal or academic art education was inaccessible. In this painting, Bouquet, background and surface further dissolve. Forms push even further to engage the edges of the canvas. Louis is experimenting with repetition and patterning, generating animated forms that resemble furry caterpillar bodies. Note how the brushwork suggests a vessel of the picture's base that is almost indistinguishable from the nearby leaves of the same color. Notice also the network or system of red, orange, and green dots hovering in space and operating as an independent layer. And here again with Fléclair, we see a near complete dissolution of any vessel or trunk. The sense of the plant form as a cohesive entity, untethered from illusionistic space, is reinforced by the blurring of any distinction between foreground and background. The conglomerate mass of leaves is hovering, levitating, furthering the sense of movement conveyed by the painting. The complex and overall application of wisps and dots generates a density that approaches the realm of abstraction. But there is a tension here, because the intense patterning Louis employs also engages what our historian Bibiana Obler calls the resources of the decorative. Louis was not trained in a certain modernist wariness of the decorative and its gendered, low art connotations. For Louis, the use of decorative elements was one more strategy to exercise in pursuit of her project, probing the intersections of visual representation and the materiality of paint. Louis' findings reveal that an approach to painting mobilizing decorative elements has more in common with abstraction than is usually or often allowed. Despite the tendency of her contemporaries to consider the abstract and the decorative at odds, in Louis' work, they become compatible processes. On February 26, 1932, after neighbors reported that Louis was going door to door announcing a coming apocalypse, she was detained by police, diagnosed with chronic hallucinatory psychosis, and subsequently committed to the asylum where she spent the rest of her life, her studio practice cut short. When questioned, Louis' assertion of her profession as an artiste peintre was noted as part of the rationale for her institutionalization. So ludicrous was the idea that an unmarried working class woman would claim to be a fine artist. The images in this slide include a photograph of Louis taken at the Claremont Asylum, a postcard showing the hospital's women's quarters, and a letter written by Louis dated February 19th, 1938, addressed to the chief of police of the Oise region. This letter, penned shortly before the opening of Masters of Popular Painting in New York, confirms that although she was no longer producing artwork, Louis was very much alive. The exhibition catalog, however, claims that, quote, in 1934, she died in a home for the aged. This alleged error appeared across Louis' exhibition history and was not corrected until the mid-1950s. This signals the importance of not underestimating the audaciousness of Louis' positioning of herself as an artist. The writer Jules Barbet d'Orvy cautioned in 1878, one day, Marie Dagot will be at the Academy of Political Science, George Sand at the Académie Française, Rosa Bonheur at the Academy of Beaux-Arts, and it will be us, the men, who will make the jams and the pickles. Indeed, it was only this past year in 2022 that Rosa Bonheur, herself a self-taught artist, was given a retrospective at Paris's Musée d'Orsay. From this perspective, keep in mind that Louis was the only woman included in Masters and in the exhibition that was its precursor, Popular Masters of Reality. Popular Masters of Reality, or Les Maîtres Populaires de la Réalité, was organized by Maximilien Gauthier of the Musée de Grenoble and took place in Paris, concurrent with the 1937 World's Fair. Popular Masters, whose title might be directly translated as Working Class Masters of Reality, then traveled to Zurich before becoming MoMA's Masters of Popular Painting. The catalog for Popular Masters of Reality includes a quote from René Huyghe, then a curator at the Musée du Louvre, that I will read in my own translation now. The extreme vogue of popular painting these days comes from the fact that it compensates for the lacuna of modern art. Above all, the extreme weariness caused by constantly encountering barriers to poetry posed by the conscious intellect. The interest in popular painting also relates to the fact that, liberated from prescribed approaches and sourced from mankind's most permanent origins, it spontaneously arrives at a mode of visual representation akin to the theoretical perspective of modern artists. It is the confirmation of a current dogma by an art situated outside of time. Huyghe's statement is particularly illustrative for me for its acknowledgement that the idea of modern art, as it was understood in France at this moment, was far from a calcified category. Plagued by critics, mired in debates pitting abstraction against realism, certainly, and also fallible, incomplete, containing gaps, voids, lacuna that might be filled by the contribution of self-taught artists. Another cultural figure who sensed this, quote, limitation leveled at modern art was Wilhelm Uhde, pictured here on the right with Seraphine Louis' painting Fréclair hanging above him. A German émigré, collector, writer, and curator, Uhde was an early proponent of Cubism who sat for a portrait by Picasso in 1910, shown on the left. Uhde's patronage ensured Louis' entrance into the annals of art history through his writing and promotion of Louis, as well as the French self-taught artist whose place in the modernist canon is unequivocally assured, Henri Rousseau, Oud established a paradigm for the inclusion of self-taught artists in modernist historiography, exemplifying a regular facet of the dynamic between self-taught artists and art world insiders that continues to operate to the present day. Oud occupied for Louis the role of passeur, or liaison, bridging the gap between Louis' marginalized position as a self-trained artist and mainstream art world circuits. Louis was the only woman included in a group of white French self-taught artists who, although they did not affiliate with each other or share aesthetic concerns, were collectively promoted through Parisian exhibitions such as 1928's Sacred Heart Painters, whose invitation is shown at left, and 1932's Modern Primitives, both organized by Wilhelm Ude. Such groupings of so-called naïfs operated as a strain of primitivism that augmented efforts by critics and curators to validate French art on the international stage during the interwar period and in subsequent decades. Note how in Louis' work from 1927 on the right, Les Rapes, the artist has already departed from conventions of realism as applied to genres of both still life and landscape. In contrast, works by other so-called Sacred Heart or modern primitive painters adhere much more closely to the still life tradition in form and facture, most importantly to realism, as these examples by Camille Bombois, Henri Rousseau, and Louis Vivin illustrate. Oud's model rehearsed tropes already present in the French imaginary, here applied to the visual arts. The supposed purity and authenticity of the peasantry became an effective palliative for assuaging anxieties amidst the crises of world wars, mounting anti-colonial movements, the economic effects of the Great Depression, and the perceived waning of France's cultural prestige and political power. As an example of the cultural milieu, the invitation to the Sacred Heart Painters, a small booklet that folds outward to advertise a concurrent show at the same gallery, is on view at the left, and showing that what was referred to as, quote, l'art nègre, or, quote, Negro art, was on view at the same gallery where the Sacred Heart Painters show was staged. Oud's Modern Primitives exhibition of 1932 followed two other Paris exhibitions at the same period. The International Colonial Exhibition, shown in a postcard on the right, and the Surrealist Critique of the same, The Truth About the Colonies, both 1931. The flourishing of attention given to self-taught painters in this moment must be considered in the context of primitivist colonialist thought and reactionary populism in France as it entered a new phase in response to mounting anti-colonial struggle. Both the Parisian Popular Masters of Reality and MoMA's Masters of Popular Painting took place during the period immediately preceding the Second World War. Significantly, these exhibitions were concurrent with the, quote, degenerate art exhibitions underway in Nazi Germany in 1937 and 38, raising the political stakes for displays of modern art in general and the works of artists deemed unschooled or, quote, primitive in specific contexts. Given the rise of nationalism during this period in France, Europe, and elsewhere, these exhibitions also played a role in solidifying the image of, quote, French modern art that was to become institutionalized after the war. Oud's model continued to find relevance beyond the MoMA exhibition. In 1951, Séraphine Louis was honored as France's, quote, great dead in the French pavilion of the inaugural Sao Paulo Biennale. Here we see Alfred Barr's French counterpart, Jean Cassou, founding director of the Musée National d'Art Moderne, who was the commissar of the French section in Sao Paulo. We also see works by Pablo Picasso and Alberto Giacometti, as well as a painting by S. Louis. In 1955, Louis and other so-called modern primitives were featured in the French section of the first installment of Documenta in Kassel, Germany in 1955. The positioning of Louis within these larger narratives, her presence at multiple critical flashpoints in the history of modernism, as well as her simultaneous absence in most mainstream art historiography of the time, at least until very recently, reflects the larger stakes of the relationship between avant-garde and self-taught artists in articulations of modernism across Europe and the Americas. It is this oscillation between the presence and absence of self-taught artists such as Louis in the historical narrative that alerts us to the constructed nature of modernist discourse itself. Its priorities, inconsistencies, and political valences become most apparent when in confrontation with forms of difference. Now to return to New York. On the left, we see Tree of Paradise, which is one of 2 works by Louis now in MoMA's collection that I'm aware of. On the right, we see Tree of Paradise as it was first shown at MoMA shortly after its acquisition. And we also see Picasso's The Charnel House in this 1971 installation view of the exhibition 20th Century Pioneers. Okay, and MoMA acquired many works that were shown in Masters of Popular Painting, as seen in, okay, sorry, this is, what we're looking at here is a 1972 installation of MoMA's permanent collection, including Seraphine Louis' Tree of Paradise, John Kane, a painting by John Kane, Thomas Pickett, and Morris Hirshfield. And however, immediately after Masters of Popular Painting, between 1941 and 1944, MoMA showed a gallery showcasing their permanent collection acquisitions from the Masters of Popular Painting show. This did not include Louis. It was not until 2019 that Louis was included in MoMA's presentation of this particular angle of its collection, shown at the right in the recent installation of the Alfred Barr Gallery, named in reference to the 1938 exhibition. And I believe that if you were to go to MoMA today, or if you were at MoMA today, I believe Tree of Paradise is currently on view in Gallery 521. Okay, so finally, I'd like to return to Louis' work to give the artist the final word, so to speak. With Feuilles Claires, Louis offers a meditation on how plants grow, representing the minute movements and oscillations of growth through the repetitive application of painted dots and patterns of waving wisps. The use of the dot, seeming in its deliberate repetition to, quote, decorate every surface of the organic form that dominates the painting, shifts the painting's temporality. Rather than a stagnant image where all facets are perceived by the viewer simultaneously, as with most two-dimensional plastic art forms, the plant's form in Feuilles Claires appears alive with movement, almost animated, in the motion of waving stems and rustling leaves. In Feuilles Claires, the pictorial strategies and spatial innovations that the artist deployed in her studio practice appear synthesized into a visual language. It is a watershed moment in Louis' representation of organic forms, where the still life genre, or French nature morte, has morphed into a vital, living ecosystem, a nature vivante. Hovering at the top of the canvas between the center and right-hand corner, Louis' signature is itself delineated by a series of wispy dots. Her work with the dots in Feuilles Claires is so complete, so thorough, that the dot motif continues onto her signature, or alternatively, her signature becomes an extension of the work that S. Louis accomplishes in her painting. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Brooke and Jennifer, for your stimulating talks. I'm going to share my screen and begin my presentation on Morris Hirshfield. I'm extremely pleased to be part of this panel and to have had such a great experience organizing the exhibition with Richard and Valerie and the incredible team at the American Folk Art Museum. The title of my talk is today, it is taken from an Art Digest review where Morris Hirshfield is called the master of the two left feet. And rather than focusing on his visual imagination and pictorial flair, which was owed in part to that unusual trait in his paintings, I'm going to actually focus on his meteoric rise in the New York art world in the 1940s, hence how he steps out from Brooklyn into Manhattan. Born in 1872 in Russia, Poland, he immigrated to New York City at the age of 18 in 1890. And for 25 years, he owned and operated a wholesale foot care business named Easy Walk Manufacturing Company. His most creative output during that time, as we saw, were the patents that for producing boudoir slippers, which were so masterfully produced, or recreated, I should say, by Liz Blatt in the exhibition. Illness forced him to give up his company, and he retired at the age of 65, at which point he began painting. The story begins with two key figures who are often overlooked in the story of Morris Hirshfield. John I.H. Bauer was a curator of American painting at the Brooklyn Museum, and who ultimately would become director of the Whitney Museum from 1968 to 74. And it seems that Morris Hirshfield thought highly enough of his own work that he began to produce in 1939, that he sought out his local museum and the curator to see what they thought of the work. Intrigued but unable to purchase any of the work, Bauer suggested that Hirshfield take his paintings into Manhattan to the Hudson Walker Gallery on East 57th Street in an effort to arrange for their sale. It was at this point, actually, and these are the two paintings that were on view, or actually not on view, as we will learn, and in fact are the first two paintings that Hirshfield painted. Janis, Sidney Janis, that is, who, like Morris Hirshfield, had also been in the rack trade, but also like Hirshfield was switching his career interest in becoming a collector and a curator, and he was preparing an exhibition for the Museum of Modern Art as a member of their advisory committee. And he went to the Hudson Walker Gallery in an effort to find artists whom he didn't know. And intrigued very much by these two pictures, whose images he could not see because they were turned to the wall, he inquired as to what they were. And I'll repeat here Janis's first encounter. I peeked at a picture whose face was to the wall. What a shock I received. In the center of this rather square canvas, two round eyes, luminously glaring into the darkness, were returning my stare. It brought to mind the sequence in Duck Soup in which Groucho Marx, confronted by an unexpected image in his mirror, was taken aback, only to find the image oddly enough immobile. The image I saw was just as unexpected, and the round, unflinching eyes continued to stare, impervious to my sudden start. They belonged to a strangely compelling creature, which, sitting possessively upon a remarkable couch, immediately took possession of me. I'd like to say that Janis's immediate reaction meant a very long-term engagement for the rest of his life and Hirshfield's career, and he played an incredibly seminal role in bringing the artist forward. The two pictures that you see on the screen are, in fact, the first two pictures that Hirshfield created. And in fact, he, not being fully confident of himself as an artist, despite the fact he had the chutzpah to take the works to the Brooklyn Museum for approval, he took paintings from his own walls and painted over them in order to create these rather fanciful designs of a depiction of a beach girl and of the Angora cat. The two paintings immediately appeared in the exhibition that Janis was preparing called Contemporary Unknown American Painters that appeared in the members room at the Museum of Modern Art. And here you'll see Hirshfield's, the number 17 and 18 included in the exhibition. And you'll note that they were on loan from Sidney Janis. And this was a remarkable moment for, or arrival, I should say, for Hirshfield, an untrained and newly minted artist. And it would be actually the beginning of Janis's greatest advocacy in the artist's rise. He immediately, excuse me, really started interacting with the artist directly, going out to Bensonhurst, where Hirshfield lived, gathering pictures. He showed the Girl in a Mirror and Tiger at another presentation at the Modern, called Modern Primitives Artists of the People. And he also amazingly convinced the museum to acquire both works in 1941. Was a remarkable feat, considering that Hirshfield had only painted 8 pictures by this moment. So committed was Janus that he included Hirshfield as the frontispiece in his book, They Taught Themselves, and which had a foreword by Alfred Barr. He also gave Hirshfield the greatest coverage in this book, giving him 26 pages of type, and against the other 25 artists that were included in the book that didn't receive as much coverage. And it's, again, just kind of to demonstrate Janus's incredible commitment to the artist. By 1942, Janus was acting as Hirshfield's actual agent, if you will, as we see in this contract between the two artists, although unfortunately unsigned by Hirshfield, but dated by Janus on February 26, 1942. And it lists the 22 paintings that Hirshfield had created up until this point. It's interesting that you'll note a number are unsold, but almost half, in fact, have already found owners through Janus's activity, 3 that he owned, the 2 in the Museum of Modern Art. Donald Ogden Stewart, who was a screenwriter, having written the Philadelphia Story, among others, owned 3 works. Samuel Lewison, who was a financier and a trustee at the Metropolitan Museum, owned Girl with a Dog from 1940, and 2 works belonged to Janus's brother, Martin. I think that this was a very interesting note, because it really demonstrates that Janus, who by this point was not officially a dealer, was in fact acting as such on behalf of Hirshfield at this early date. It wouldn't be until 1948 that he would open his gallery in New York on 57th Street. Another important development in Hirshfield's career occurred when Peggy Guggenheim returned to America from war-torn Europe. And here we see her arriving with her then husband, Max Ernst, who indeed was a little bit more famous than she was at the time. The 2 of them settled into a townhouse on Beekman Place, which became very much a center of activity around the immigrant artists that were finding themselves on American shores. Peggy herself was involved in readying her Art of the Century gallery, which would feature the art collection that she had assembled in Europe. This just showed, to give you an example of the kinds of artists that were in and out of Beekman Place on a regular basis. We see here Max Ernst, Frederick Kiesler seated on the ground, André Breton in the middle, Ferdinand Léger, and many other, all standing together in front of the massive fireplace in that Beekman Place townhouse. This photograph shows actually Ernst in a more leisurely capacity, seated amongst Peggy's collection. We see the Kandinsky, just left to right, her Kandinsky, the Duchamp, Sad Young Man on a Train, the Braque painting, the Claret, and a Picasso Cubist painting, all from between 1911 and 1914, as well as Kachina dolls that Ernst himself was starting to collect from the Carstairs Gallery on 2nd Avenue. But I think most interesting is the fact that Hirshfield appears so prominently among these European masters, as you'll note above the chair in the far right corner. And this is an image of the nude at the window from 1941 that, in fact, Peggy had acquired from Janus sometime between February and the fall of 1942. Ernst would use the Hirshfield painting as a type of surrealist gesture in a kind of performance piece. He brought the painting from its place in the living room down to his painting studio, and and staged this photograph of André Breton, Duchamp, and Ernst looking over the painting while Lenore Carrington, who was Ernst's former lover, gently rocks in a chair with a large gourd between her legs. And a fur-cloaked mannequin, often a surrealist trope, wears a mask, stands guard over the scene. You'll note that behind them is Ernst's own paintings called Surrealism in Painting, which is now in the Menil collection. By this time, Breton and Duchamp were pretty well familiar with Hirshfield, and whether Hirshfield ever visited the Beekman Place townhouse, we don't know. It's could be likely. It wouldn't have been unusual. I know that Cornell was often in and out of that house as he and Duchamp were preparing the Duchamp's Boiton valise in those early days. But it's interesting that Breton and Duchamp, in preparing their exhibition called First Papers of Surrealism, which was held at the White Law Reed Mansion in New York, that they included Hirshfield in the exhibition as the only self-taught painter included, although there were other American artists included, such as on the far right is a early state of a Motherwell painting. This particular image shows Duchamp's kind of ability to mask the ornateness of the mansion by covering it with a mile of string in this very well-known installation of his. The catalog for the exhibition First Papers of Surrealism included Hirshfield, as we see, this is the page that includes the Hirshfield painting, and the compensation portrait rather than images of the artist. And then for Hirshfield, it was John Muir, the Scottish-born environmentalist and founder of the Sierra Club, who represented the artist. And then this is a color image of the painting, which you would be able to see if you visit the exhibition today, which in fact Janice donated to the Museum of Modern Art in 1967, along with 6 other Hirshfield pictures. Janice next convinced MoMA in his ongoing efforts to promote Hirshfield's career to devote an entire exhibition to Hirshfield's painting. To date, that included the 30 pictures that he had made thus far. This is a photograph of the invitation for the exhibition opening on the 22nd of June, and a stage photograph taken by Arnold Newman showing the former slipper maker or tailor maker with a full-scale drawing of Inseparable Friends, which was included in the show and part of the elaborate diagram that Janice produced in order to indicate the sources from which a lot of Hirshfield's paintings emanated. And I'm sorry that Richard's talk earlier today wasn't able to delve into that, because it's a very significant part of what happened at MoMA in 1943, and then is also very present in the exhibition at the American Folk Art Museum today. So there was a lot of internal disagreement about giving this relatively unknown artist such exposure, and indeed the critics eviscerated the museum for showing it. They lashed out at the director and particularly also at the artist. And this is when Hirshfield earned the moniker of the master of the 2 left feet and a painter from deep in the wilds of Brooklyn. I'm just going to show you 2 installation shots from that MoMA show. And I've chosen these particularly because they are works that are not in the current exhibition. On the left is Loving Mother and Child, which is now in a museum in Japan, and a painting called Peacock, which Janice had sold to his sister, whose whereabouts today is unfortunately unknown. And some other images of Bathing Beauty, which the museum director of the Kunstmuseum in Basel, Franz Meyer, bought, and Patriotic Children, which is now in the collection of Bruno Bischofberger, the gallerist, who himself showed Hirshfield's work in 1968. And at the bottom slide, we see Coquette, now in a private collection in Austria, and College Ground, which is in fact in the exhibition today that you would see. It's just interesting that it kind of shows a wide variety, not only of the type of work Hirshfield was doing of women or children and animals and landscapes, but also how the works traveled, which was one of my great interests in working on the exhibition, how they found new homes. I hope it won't come as much surprise to people or to our audience today to know that works of art on view in museums were often for sale. It's not a practice that continues today by any stretch of the means, but it wasn't at all unusual. And I'm just showing you here a letter from a gentleman by the name of J.P. Deering, who was associated with an art gallery in Boston called the Stewart Art Gallery, inquiring as to the prices for what the pictures were. And you'll note that they range from $1,100 down to $475, which was a considerable amount of money for the time. Deering did not end up buying anything, but he did stage a show of Hirshfield's work in Boston in 1944, on which 4 pictures were included. Visiting the exhibition was Peggy Guggenheim, who already owned the Nude at the Window, but she was incredibly taken with 2 women in front of a mirror, which was the largest painting in the exhibition and was for sale for $1,100. So she bought it immediately. She paid 5% commission to the museum and 5% commission to Janus. Whether Hirshfield received any money, unfortunately, we don't know. But it became, at that time, the most expensive painting in her collection. And it is a work that still is in the collection today. Just to demonstrate how Janus was really pushing Hirshfield's career and setting kind of outlandish prices. Here we see a memorandum of understanding. In other words, we should consider that an on-consignment agreement for this painting, Stage Beauties, at $2,500, which again in 1944 was a significant amount of money. Sadly, the painting remained in the Janus family and ultimately was given by Carol Janus to the Metropolitan Museum of Art within the last 2 decades. Hirshfield died in July of 1946 at the age of 74, which prompted Peggy Guggenheim to quickly assemble a memorial exhibition of his work. And this, in fact, showed his full output between the time of the MoMA show and 4 years later, what he had painted, or actually 3 years later, I should say, because he dies in July of 46. These are just, I don't have any installation views of that exhibition because Peggy threw away everything, or she put it out on the street when she shuttered the gallery in 1947, just after this show was closed. So here again, pictures that were included in the Art of this Century exhibition, which are not included in the current presentation. Cats in the Snow and Private Collection, the rabbi who's we still have been unable to locate, and one of only 3 pictures of that Hirshfield produced on a Jewish theme. Birds at a Gate from 45 in a private collection in Texas, and The Persian Kitten in a Garden, also from 45, the estate of Maria and Conrad Janus. I think these pictures show you kind of the breadth of what the artist was doing, and the elaborate patterning and incredible palette that he used, and just fanciful, imaginative, crazy, and joyous works that he produced. My contribution to the exhibition and to the show was really about tracking the provenance and exhibition history of all of the works. And to that end, I relied very heavily on the list of paintings that Hirshfield's daughter, Hannah Renzer, prepared just after his death, and which served as a kind of guide, not only for me in reconstructing everything, but an indication of how much had already passed into the world, or was, had found homes, as well as those works that still remained with the family. And then I'm just showing you two pages of the contribution of the catalog of works I made to Richard's Master of the Two Left Feet. So it's just a very brief introduction to this incredibly fast rise of a artist who lives now in many of our hearts and minds as just a remarkable painter. I mean, it was in 2015 that Richard and I first met when I was a curator at the Guggenheim. We both had an interest in the artist and came together to create an exhibition. And it's been the past 7 years of our lives, and just a wonderful and great to have it in New York and available to so many different people to see and experience. So thank you.
I want to thank Susan, Brooke, and Jennifer for those remarkable presentations, which I really enjoyed. And I thought we could spend a few minutes talking a little bit about some commonalities within the presentations. Something that occurred to me quite early on was how much of the research and the presentations as they existed in this symposium had to do with the role of the mediator, the person, often many people, but often one, someone who rises to the forefront as someone who championed that artist, and the inevitable power dynamic between that person and the artist. In many ways, these mediators are the reason that we today know this work, can see this work, the reason this work has survived in many ways for us to look at now. But of course, it's often through the lens of that mediator and the various things that would have affected their decisions in terms of how to position and present the work that continue to shape the way those artists and their work is understood now. And I wondered if each of you could talk about how you in your practice see or how you balance that, because we of course are our own mediators now in terms of presenting both of those issues.
Yeah, so much in that question, so much in all the talks. My notebook is full already. And we're only halfway, or not even through our day. Yeah, and thinking, Susan, with the sales of works from an exhibition, which was true for the Edmondson show too. I was quickly going back to my notes on the sales from the Edmondson show. Those were, and the Ark sold for 60, or was listed for 60. The Preacher and the Lawyer, those are two-figure sales under 100. And so to see numbers in the 4 figures, it's just such a contrast. And I know that Doll Wolf had Julian Levy half the prices because she didn't think they could go for 120. So move them for 60 to get money back to Edmondson. So that's a story in which Doll Wolf is acting in effect with some speed and haste, and in the interest of returning money to the artist. Who doesn't, as far as we know, that there's 1 or 2 conflicting accounts, doesn't go to his own show at MoMA, unlike Hirshfield. So I think that way in which there's this sort of network of sort of well-meaning and activist and self-consciously interracial artistic agitators see themselves as acting on behalf of an artist, and doing so at a much different kind of level of activity and capacity as we see across the comparison in this panel, across the 3. And then how gender plays in too with Brooke's paper, to see exactly how, even within the outsider canon, there's still pitched hierarchies between how artists are experiencing that experience of, or experiencing that process of being mediated. How we do that too is part of a politics and praxis, and thinking where and how, for my practice, where and how honorariums sit in my bank account or go elsewhere, how to distribute some of the sort of benefits that accrue to the mediator, and ensure that to sort of take the lessons from my own history, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. There is so much here. In the case of Seraphine Louis and the relationship with the mediator that in so many ways defined her career, Wilhelm Ude, Ude is writing about Louis, or the idea of Louis, or the idea of her work that he put forward, was recycled and reused subsequently so many times. He published, his own books and essays about Louis and other artists, and then those excerpts from those texts were reprinted in exhibition catalogs, as recently as 2009. So not only did he sort of shape the historiography and the exhibition history of Louis, his interpretation of her work became so foundational, and and even more so, he actually named her. He gave her the name of Seraphine de Senlis and of just Seraphine. And I wanted to highlight how that's a very different situation than the context in, for example, Brazil, where using the first name of an artist is doesn't have the same kind of effect that it has here, that I find. If Louis had signed her painting Seraphine, then I would say, by all means, let's refer to her as Seraphine, for example. But I'm trying to start moving towards referring to her as S. Louis, because that's how she signed almost all of her paintings. And indeed, in terms of, I didn't go, so I guess how I try to kind of push back against there always being this mediating figure standing between an artist and the reception of their work is by trying to foreground Louis's work as really, for me, the only reliable source of primary source material that's out there, because any comments that are attributed to Louis have been they're anecdotal, right? I mean, we have the letters that she penned while she was incarcerated. She doesn't speak directly about her paintings there, however. So focusing on her work is, for me, it's one way to kind of push back against what I found in a lot of the literature from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on, was so focused on these kind of myths and tropes of an errant, kind of a overly eroticized, sexualized femininity, Louis' Catholicism being almost exploited to kind of distort or obscure the fact that whatever her views and whatever her motivations were, she nonetheless spent her days working as a house cleaner and then her nights off in painting all night. That's a serious studio practice that she made a lot of sacrifices for. So I just suggest that we focus on what actually is going on the canvases.
Mm-hmm. I've sort of lost track of the question, but I think that it's not unusual for artists to have intermediaries. They kind of rely on them. I mean, that's the role of they're not always, in other words, the artists themselves are not always their best salesperson, despite the fact that Hirshfield actually took his work first to the Brooklyn Museum in the hopes of getting some level of feedback. And he was, I mean, I don't think he ever expected what ended up happening for him in the relationship that he and Janice built together. But there's no doubt that Janice really went to great lengths to promote the artist, and rather successfully, not only just in the 40s, but in the 50s too. There were important shows in Europe and in Paris and in Zurich, and also a lot of sales made to Europeans at that time. But by the 60s, the interest in his work, and I think a lot of untrained artists started to fall off, and it hasn't been until more recently that reconsideration has been given to these remarkable painters and sculptors, which brings us really here today and what the exhibition has been about.
Thanks, Susan. No, I think that's true. I think it's hard. The thing I find particularly interesting, it's hard, for example, to think if we were doing a symposium about really any other artists that we have on view here at MoMA, about the amount of time we would spend talking, for example, about who brought that work to the attention of the curator who eventually did the show, or who selected that work, or the various ways in which that work was received. I mean, I always find that fascinating, but it's much less likely to happen with a trained versus untrained artist. Which brings me, and we're getting a bit close to time, but brings me to the another question about the ways in which often these artists are mediated or understood, which is via biography. And that was something that I thought was particularly apparent in Brooke's presentation and in Susan's as well, that idea that what the artists did for their day job and the various maladies or other life things that affected that artist in many ways explained the work, perhaps in a way that is either completely ignored often with more mainstream artists, or that is very much talked about in conjunction with, as opposed to the rationale behind the work. And so I thought, again, if each of you could talk a little bit, knowing that we're just again running up against time, about the way that biography specifically played into your thinking about how you present these artists' work.
I mean, I would just, if I can just start, I'll just say for Richard, Valerie, and me, as we thought about the exhibition now of Hirshfield's work, we actually pretty much removed the biography element from it, with the exception of showing his early patents and therefore their recreation by Liz Blatt. So, I mean, I think the exhibition was more about on type of works that he was making, broken down into, various genres, whether it's animals or stage beauties or landscapes, etc. That said, we did make an exception with the whole surrealist component because it was important for both of us to really place the artist within the context of what was going on in the New York art world, which he was interacting with. I mean, if you read his invitation list to his MoMA show, it's a very impressive group of high-level New York collectors and shakers in a way. So despite the fact he seemed to be out in the wilds of Brooklyn, he was actually pretty stepping right into what was going on into Manhattan. But it's also really hard to not look at a biography for an artist. It informs so much of how their work comes forward in a way.
Yeah, I might even push back in some ways on some of this, because the idea of mediators for artists, I think what's exciting about our talks today and about the field of self-taught art is how that kind of social network or practice or decision-making is part of the conversation, not kind of kept sort of beyond, out of view as though it's just the artist's genius that happened and all things were taken care of. And likewise with biography, I think storytelling about how life and work intermesh and how those, the social practice of sort of being a person in a certain historical moment is part of the work's becoming. And so while those focal points for the self-taught field have absolutely been a source of baggage, and I think in Edmondson's case, he knows very well how he's being narrativized as a mythological, biographical figure. I think he plays that as part of his medium and constructs himself within that space. So I'm not sort of discounting at all the ways in which that has obscured the artworks and the sort of charge to us to bring the artworks forward. But I would hate for us to bring the artworks forward and lose some of the contextual texture of of the social networks, of the lived experience. I want more of that in sort of traditional art history, I would say, rather than less of that here, maybe, is the pushback.
I think that's absolutely right, Jennifer.
Fair enough.
Quickly, I specifically didn't rehearse the Wilhelm Muda's claims the way he starts every writing about Séraphine Louis by saying that he met her because she was working as his house cleaner in Senlis, where he was renting an apartment. For example, I also didn't, and I, even though myself, I'm trained as a mental health therapist, I don't try to psychoanalyze Louis or her work. Although many have certainly read her work as a I'm not saying that doing so through a lens informed by a critical art therapy practice wouldn't be interesting, as it would be for any artist. I think, just to kind of respond to what Jennifer Marshall just said, that the stakes of biography are so high with self-taught artists, and I think that's why this field has so much to teach broader fields of modern and contemporary art about the ethics of inclusion and of looking at biography.
I would like just to jump in and share. We have a few questions, but we are also running a little late. So I would like to share a few questions with you, and then we will wrap up and have a short break. So we have a question for you, Esther, and I think everyone can address it here. It's a question about where does this moment, a particular moment in the interwar, with Barr's program and vision of an inclusion of self-taught artists, stand in the history of MoMA today, and can it serve and does it serve as a form of model, as institutions like MoMA are in our current moment where we look for more inclusivity and diversity?
I hope so. I mean, I think that's really why, as many people noted, all of this work all of a sudden was on view again in 2019, which was yet again the museum's rethinking of the way it presents its permanent collection and the type of stories that that we tell. So I think part of it is a recognition, as Jennifer so beautifully put, that in fact these different ways of looking at art beyond just the object, the figure who did it, into the networks and the conversations and the supporters, and that all of that is in fact part of a story that we can tell at an institution like this, is important and interesting.
And do anyone wants to add anything maybe to that, Suzanne?
No, I mean, I agree with what you're saying. Absolutely.
There's a question about Hirshfield's process for you, Suzanne. Did Hirshfield work on paper first and enlarge and put to canvas? What were his influences? It's a pretty large question. If you can...
Well, he did make drawings for every painting, so he did start by drawing. How he actually transferred them, they're full scale, the exact same size as the pictures, and about 40 of them are extant. The others, I think, were thrown out. But we were unable to really determine how he transferred the tracing onto the canvas. It was not done by pouncing, which would have been a traditional method where you poke holes in the paper and then spread charcoal or some other light medium over it to give you the tracing. It remains an interesting puzzle for us to figure out.
Susan, did you guys look at carbon paper at all? Would that have been available?
There are no traces of carbon paper on the paintings or on the drawings.
So another mysterious element to resolve in the future.
Yeah, it truly is.
So yes, I would like to thank you all for these wonderful talks and also this great conversation. Thank you for being part of this symposium. And thank you, Esther, for being such a wonderful host and also giving us a very nuanced tableau of the interwar and MoMA's program. So that was really great to start the day with you all.